Let's start with Arab nationalism. What exactly is Arab nationalism, and what makes it unique? Nationalism is a concept that is in no way specific to the Middle East, and no way specific to the time frame of the 1930s to the end of the 1970s. So, let's just try and nail down a brief definition of nationalism before we delve deeper into what the Arab variety was. Merriam-Webster defines nationalism as
1. Loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations or supranational groups.
Okay, so then what's a nation?
A community of people composed of one or more nationalities and possessing a more or less defined territory and government.
Right. Are you starting to see the problem? If, for the vast majority of their existences, the nations of the Middle East were never really nations at all, then wouldn't the term Arab nationalism seem to be a bit of an oxymoron? Yes and no. Okay, let's look at this a different way. So, what do these terms nationalism and nation actually mean? And how do they help us comprehend this seemingly incomprehensible region? Nationalism is a loaded term in our modern context. We sometimes seem to incorrectly use it interchangeably with terms like populism and xenophobia. Depending on the context, nationalism can be viewed positively or negatively, depending on who's trying to evoke it and who is attempting to harness it. For our purposes, we will try and define the term by its dictionary definition, free from any of the associations that are lumped in with it, namely, that is, in its most basic form, nationalism is a loyalty and devotion to a nation. So, what exactly is Arab nationalism? Arab nationalism, like its larger umbrella term, is not a simple or fixed term to define. There are different kinds of Arab nationalism based on interpretations of history, regional complexities, and religious motivations. According to Patrizia Menducci, there are three predominant phenomena within the context of Arab nationalism to discuss, and which are somewhat, but not completely, distinct from each other. Arabism, namely the Arabic language and culture; Pan-Arabism, which we will discuss in further detail much later; and nationalism on a local basis. For our purposes, we shall take our definition of nationalism from earlier and apply it to the Arab world and peoples. Put them together, and what do you get? Arab nationalism is a sense of loyalty and devotion towards the Arab nations, the Arab culture, the Arabic language, and/or Arab customs. Now, that might sound simple and straightforward, but what do you actually know about the Middle East? What exactly is Arab culture? Does that simply imply that Kuwaitis and Tunisians share similar diet and musical tastes? Is Sudan automatically considered an Arab nation because it speaks Arabic? And how does Islam play in when countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Syria have significant Christian populations? These are the issues with trying to pin down exactly what Arab nationalism is, and why the simple definition we produced earlier runs into some problems. So, how do we move forward? Let's first begin with a history lesson. As discussed earlier, the peoples and nations of what we now call the Middle East have eternally been conquered and subjugated from both within and without. But the period I'd like to focus on particularly is during the rule of the Ottoman Empire. It would be easy to believe that just because the Ottomans were mostly Muslims and the Arabs were mostly Muslim, that the relationship would be a smooth one. But the truth is quite different. The Philippines are over 85% Catholic, as is Mexico, and both were colonized and ruled over by Spain for centuries. But that doesn't mean that their cultures are in any way similar. So then, how could someone in Yemen claim to be culturally identical enough to someone in Libya, or at least enough to justify being one state together in a hypothetical Arab Union that would stretch across the Persian Gulf, the Levant, and northern Africa. Just as with the rise of Pan-Slavism rose up in defiance to the Ottomans, so too did they manage to elicit a Pan-Arabism, united in its hatred and desires to be free from said Ottomans. But just like what happened in the Balkans, it's easier to define who you are in opposition to a much larger force. But what happens when you win? What happens when you free yourself and you find that not being an Ottoman doesn't make a Bulgarian the same as a Bosnian? What happens when you're finally free? You get to define who you are. Maybe we're more Russian than we thought. Maybe that land is actually mine. Maybe I'm not actually Slavic, but the inheritor of one of the greatest empires ever. Before you know it, we're fighting with our old brothers and comrades. There is a term for this phenomenon. It's called Balkanization, when you realize that maybe you don't have as much in common as you think. That was a fatal flaw of Arab Union, and as a whole, Arab nationalism. It predicated its claims and beliefs on the idea that Islam as a religion and Arabic as a language were enough to be the glue that propped together a hypothetical union, and would paper over the many cultural differences that may exist within the smaller sectors of the region. The first inklings and manifestations of Arab Union and nationalism as more than just a feeling actually arose out of Saudi Arabia. As mentioned before, Ibn Saud wanted to revive Wahhabism, wanted to look to the greatness of the past rather than the future. And to them, what was the greatest time period? The Caliphates. It was their belief that if they went back to a more pure, unadulterated concentrate of Islam, they would be able to revive and rouse a sense of unity amongst the peoples of the Middle East, and begin to create their own brand of unity not based on the decaying Ottoman infrastructures that had held everything together for centuries. And in some ways, it worked. This glorification of the past resonated with many, not just in the Arabian Peninsula, but in the region at large. In Egypt, a budding political faction was beginning to build up a base and power structure with many of the same beliefs, until the movement was officially banned in 1954. Their name was, and still is, the Muslim Brotherhood. But even with this renewed desire to return to Islam, there were still cracks and dividing lines. Who actually is a Muslim? How do you reckon with the Sunni-Shia divide? And for that matter, what do you do with Muslims who aren't, quote-unquote, Arab? What of the Muslims who don't want to turn back the clock 800 years? If Islam was the basis of Arab nationalism, what of the significant Christian, Jewish, and Druze populations? Their families and ancestors had been living side by side to their Muslim neighbors for centuries. Are they Arab as well? These questions are ones that are still debated to this day, and in them we start to see the chinks in the armor of Arab nationalism. So, if not religion, would language be the bind that ties? There are roughly 422 million people today who speak Arabic, and it is actually one of the most commonly spoken tongues on earth. But just as with English, or Spanish, or French, does that mean that they all speak the same dialect? And does Arabic only exist in Arabic nations? Chad is a northern central African nation, not an Arab or a Middle Eastern one, but Arabic is one of the two national languages, and Islam makes up over half of the religious worship in the country. Does this make Chad an Arab nation? Not according to the Arab League. And what if an Arab country doesn't only speak Arabic? In Algeria, Arabic is one of two national languages, the other being Berber, and with French still being spoken by a majority of the population. Is Algeria still technically Arab? In Iraq, Arabic shares weight with Kurdish, just as it does with English in Sudan. Arabic is no different than any other major language, in that it has different accents, idioms, and regionalisms. Lebanese Arabic sounds sing-songy. Egyptian Arabic is faster and more garbled. A quote-unquote standard Arab accent might as well be as impossible to pin down as which Latin American country has the most quote-unquote standard Spanish. The language of Islam is Arabic, but not all Muslims speak Arabic, and conversely, not everyone who speaks Arabic is a Muslim. So how do you square peg that circle hole? How do you reckon with the fact that the two pillars of your nationalist beliefs and justifications for a grand union might not be as concrete as you initially believed? Contrasted with the Ottomans, the Arabs might have seen themselves as homogeneous. But what about when the Ottomans were gone? Who are you then? Well, the answer they got was a stunted and bastardized one. As the Ottomans were being expelled, the British and the French had harnessed and aimed this new and still somewhat amorphous ideology of Arab nationalism at the Ottomans and set them loose. But once the deed was done, and when it came time to actually allow them to realize their aspirations, things took a bit of a different turn. Instead of a grand Arab union, they found that they had only replaced Ottoman overlordship with Western European colonialism. One Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot Agreement, and San Remo Conference later, the British and French privately set themselves up to be in the region for the long haul, no matter what they were telling the Arabs publicly. After a widespread insurrection in Iraq had to be put down, as well as growing and increasingly more violent tensions between the Arabs and the ever-growing number of arriving Zionists, Britain knew it had some appeasing to do. Remember our friends the Hashemites from way back in the Saudi unification section? Here's where they get their due, albeit briefly. The British created a new nation out of mandatory Palestine and established it as a new emirate. They named it Transjordan, exempted it from Zionist immigration, and gave it to their Saudi ally Hussein's son Abdullah. On the other side of the Levant, they expanded the borders of Iraq and made his other son Faisal king. Mandatory Palestine, meanwhile, would still be governed directly under British authority. France, meanwhile, used the tried and true colonial technique of divide and conquer. As it had with the Ottoman Empire, France claimed to be the protector of the Christians and Christendom, and as such, decided to slice off a section of the Syrian Mandate and create the Mandate of Greater Lebanon. In it, they would ensure that the Maronite Christians would always be the largest and most dominant group. The French, then, went about dividing Syria into the 5 sectors of Jebel Druze, the state of Aleppo, the state of Damascus, the Sanjak of Alexandria, and the Alawite state. The French had done an efficient job of sectioning, but then, in 1925, there was a general uprising in both Syria and Lebanon with the express purpose of expelling them. It was put down, eventually and violently, but the revolt would serve as another unifying drive against the oppressor. Sound familiar? Something important to note is that these nations that were created, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, they were pretty much pulled out of thin air. Yes, the Maronite Christians of Mount Lebanon had a strong separate identity, but there weren't enough of them to justify the borders the French had created for Lebanon. Transjordan and Iraq were just meant to placate the Hashemite leaders of the Arab revolt, not your garden variety Arab on the street. The problem was, people didn't yet consider themselves Jordanians or Lebanese, but still saw themselves as they had during the Ottoman days, as Sunnis, Maronites, Druze. But that would soon change. While this was all happening, something else was starting to brew. Not everyone wanted to be Arab. Not everyone agreed what it meant to be Arab. Not everyone agreed about how to move forward. And thus, we arrive at our next stop on the train of Arab nationalism, which by the 1930s was beginning to take a different shape. Not so much a region-wide ideology of unity born against the Ottomans, but against smaller subsets and groups. Not so much an Arab-wide loyalty, but more towards those now within your specific borders and tribes and with whom you have had more of a shared history, and almost more so against those ruling over you now. Arab nationalism in Syria was born out of hatred towards France, whereas in Iraq it was more towards their own Arab leader. Balkanization was beginning to take root, and nowhere was this more evident, this subsectary sense of devotion and nationalism, rather than a regional version of Arab nationalism, in none other than Iraq. Iraq is an excellent case example of this new form of Arab nationalism, how it can be different than something like Pan-Arabism, how it can come to power, what it does while there, and what can cause its eventual demise. It's also relevant because it is an important player later on in our story of the United Arab Republic. You see, Iraq is kind of a special country. When we think of it nowadays, we think of this. But Iraqi culture and society and history go so much farther back than just the early 90s. It actually goes back to the cradle of civilization. Oh yeah, the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all grew out of what is now known as Iraq. And while it has transformed and changed and morphed into something almost completely different over the years, Iraqi culture and society is much older and more complex than we in the West give it credit for. The history of Iraq could be its own 8-hour series, but all you need to know right now is that Arab nationalism and Iraqi nationalism share many, many things in common. But not everything. Iraq has a claim to its own history outside of the Arab context. Just because they shared an adversary in the Ottoman Empire does not mean that Saudi Arabia and Iraq are the same. Iraq is its own entity, as is Syria and Egypt. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. When we last left them off in the context of our story, they had a shiny new Hashemite king, Faisal I, who was installed by the British. Well, the Brits would need to do more than just install him and hope for the best. It became evidently clear, at least in the beginning, that Britain was the real power in the country. That's not to say that Faisal didn't have ambitions of his own. As mentioned earlier, he was still seeking a union with his brother in Transjordan and his father in Arabia. Such a union would have undoubtedly created a state large enough and powerful enough to rule over the entire region for decades to come. It didn't happen. Ibn Saud defeated his father and Saudi was taken off the table, though this setback was by no means the end of the Hashemites' designs. Another plan was to fuse Iraq and Syria together, but this failed to materialize due to France rebuffing the idea. Ironically, Faisal had already been a king in Syria in a previous life until the bloody Franco-Syrian War, and thus any ambitions of a union with Syria were therefore a non-starter. Despite this, Faisal had seen his popularity grow within the region and amongst many nationalists. His kingdom, despite nominally still being hooked to the British, was no longer a mandate and became a fully fledged kingdom of its own, a feat celebrated in the region, though, as with everything else in this story, this popularity was fleeting. Earlier, when Ibn Saud had come to power after conquering his father's lands, relations between Saudi Arabia and Iraq had grown cooler, though not outright hostile. The plans for a Hashemite unified state took a very serious blow, though they weren't completely dead yet. The most likely option for a union, therefore, came with neighboring Transjordan and his brother Abdullah. Although Faisal I died in 1933, his dreams would not die with him. He was succeeded by his son Ghazi, who died in a car accident in 1939, and was in turn succeeded by his infant son Faisal II. Iraq in the 1940s was a turbulent place. Although Iraq was now a formally independent and sovereign nation, as well as a member of the League of Nations, the British continued to exercise great power and presence. This would lead to the nationalists growing ever stronger and more popular due to their demands that they leave. Add to that some growing ethnic strife, and uprisings were beginning to crop up, namely concerning the Assyrians, Yazidis, and Shias. It was becoming evidently clear that Iraq was seemingly coming undone at the seams, and while the king wasn't a target yet, the army was growing increasingly antsy. 2 coups occurred between 1941 and 46, the most important of which was the one in 41, which brought the pro-Nazi Rashid Ali al-Gaylani to power. The British did not take kindly to this development and began a second occupation of the country that would last until the end of World War II. Our next pivotal moment in Iraqi history comes on July 14, 1958. First, some background. In the years and months leading up to the 14th, nationalist sentiments were growing ever more prevalent, most especially in the army, and most especially in the upper echelons of said army. Faisal II, now of age and having assumed the throne from his uncle and regent Abdullah, brother to the deceased Ghazi, set about accomplishing the goal his father had so fervently strove for: unification. Not with Syria, not with Saudi Arabia, but with neighboring Transjordan and his cousin King Hussein. On February 14, 1958, Al-Ittihad Al-Arabi Al-Hashimi, or in English, the Hashemite Arab Federation, was formed, finally completing a dream half a century in the making. The federation was formed based on their shared pro-Western and monarchist beliefs and regimes, and was a response to developments happening right around the corner. It was meant to solidify Hashemite hegemony in the southern Levant, and to block an ever-encroaching Soviet Union, who was quickly gaining influence with certain neighbors. A pivotal player in this scene is an Iraqi politician by the name of Nur Saeed, the Prime Minister of the newly formed Hashemite Arab Federation. The military and foreign policy was meant to be jointly decided, while the internal affairs of both Transjordan and Iraq were meant to be handled internally. This was the original plan, but not all were happy with this sudden change in affairs, and within a few months they would make themselves known. Border tensions with the also newly formed United Arab Republic allowed certain individuals in the military to take advantage and mask some military movements of their own. When King Hussein requested Iraqi military support over fears that spreading unrest in Lebanon might spill over into Jordan, Brigadier Abdul Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdus Salam Arif secretly aimed their troops in a different direction: Baghdad. And on July 14th, the beginning of the end came for the Iraqi monarchy. Qasim and Arif were members of an underground military organization named the Free Officers, and were inspired by the 1952 overthrow of the Egyptian monarchy, and believed in the pan-Arabist ideals espoused by the new, fiery Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, who will be a central figure later on in this series of videos. We'll get to him in a little bit. The first thing Qasim and Arif did once they had seized Baghdad was, as is almost customary in all modern coups, seize the central broadcasting station in Baghdad and broadcast the announcement of their revolution. They proclaimed a new republic and elections in the near future. Their next step was to liquidate the old monarchy, and to avoid any YouTube problems, let's just say it wasn't pretty. By the time it was done, Faisal, his uncle Abdullah, Prime Minister Nur Saeed, as well as most of the royal family, had been butchered. And now, Iraq entered a new stage, the Iraqi Republic. So, before we move any further, we need to stop and ask ourselves, why Iraq? Why did the Iraqi monarchy fall? And who exactly were these nationalists? And what did they want? And what does this have to do with our topic of Arab nationalism? What began as a desire for independence from the Ottomans shifted to a resentment towards British dominion. In 1919, the Kurds rose up in defiance and were bloodily put down. Even when the kingdom had been declared in 1921, still, they weren't free. Slowly and publicly, a new social and economic order was created in Iraq, with cooperation and deference to the British. The Iraqi people saw this new aristocracy being created, and found themselves being reduced more and more to serfdom. More and more, the nationalism of the 1920s and 30s, namely that of independence from the Ottomans and a glorious vision of a unified state, morphed into something else. Through the 40s and 50s, it became more focused, more local, more about ideals, less about opposition. Arab nationalism evolved more into Iraqi nationalism, Syrian nationalism, Egyptian nationalism. They had many overlaps, but the Syrian experience was not the same as the Jordanian. Thus, different breeds of nationalism would naturally develop. And thus, after all we've discussed, we arrive at a definition of Arab nationalism I believe we can use going forward. Arab nationalism, a loyalty to the Arab cultural values, the Arabic spoken language, and manifested through the lens of the unique social and economic factors of the individual Arab nation-states. I think that works. That's not to say that Pan-Arabism wasn't still prevalent, and the dream of an Arab Union wasn't making a resurgence. They very much were. But this time around, unlike in the 1920s, something was different. Something had been injected into these ideologies, a new strain of an old pathogen. The Hashemite Arab Federation was created in opposition to it, but ultimately succumbed to this new player on the Middle Eastern scene, just as it had felled the monarchy of Egypt and the First Syrian Republic. This, my friends, is when we introduce our next major actor in the play that is the Middle East, Arab socialism. Hey guys, thank you for watching. I'm sorry it took so long. This one is a bit of a longer video. The next one might take a little longer to make because it's going to be even longer. It's where we finally get to the part of the video where what this was all originally supposed to be about, the United Arab Republic, and it's also going to take on the form of Arab socialism and Baathism, and it's going to be a long one, but and it might take a while, but I'm very excited to get it out to you guys. Thank you. I really hope you enjoyed it. This was part 2, and I'm going to be working on getting part 3. First, before we go any further, I want to thank all the artists who helped. Without them, this video would have taken a year to make, and it would not look as good as it did. I am truly, eternally grateful towards them. And I'm going to put a bunch of links down to their Twitters and their, YouTubes, all of that stuff down there. So the first one up is Teutonikus, who is an amazing artist who makes post-apocalyptic stuff, and it looks really good. It's not Poland. I mean, the Poland wall stuff looks great, but the post-apocalyptic stuff even looks better, so go check it out. Next is Teabag, who is a South Korean artist who once again creates amazing art. You should go check out their Twitter. And finally, Nomad, who is a Mexican artist who is also a YouTuber and who's actually making a video on Quebec, and I'm telling you guys, it looks friggin' amazing. Go check out Teabag, and that's gonna wrap it up for me. Thank you once again. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, any complaints, any compliments, anything, leave it down below. If you like the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. My Twitter, all that stuff is down there, and I look forward to speaking to you guys soon. Alright guys, take it easy.